So she's a Green Party spokesperson and have a portfolio in tertiary education, drug law reform, and mental health, and a bunch of other things.
Yes.
She snatched up the Auckland Central seat in 2020, and most importantly, gained worldwide fame with her "Okay Boomer" quote.
Like 4 years ago. Still follows me around.
It's Chlöe Swarbrick.
Well done. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us today. We're going to get straight into it. So
Let's
we've
go.
got sustainability, tertiary education, mental health, and some cheeky quickfires at the end.
Lovely.
Awesome. So first up, sustainability. We know vulnerable communities are impacted by climate change. What can be done to further reduce marginalisation and inequality of these groups?
Yeah, really good question. I think this goes to the heart of, to be honest, when we talk about the economy. So frequently you'll hear that things like raising the minimum wage or climate action need to be traded off against this really ambiguous notion of whatever, particularly the right wing of politics, will tell you the economy is. So I think it's really worthwhile unpacking those assumptions. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the economy? We're talking about all of us, the stuff that we create, and the environment that we live in. Somewhere along the way in the last particularly 40 years, that notion of the economy has become really bound up in the concept of GDP. So then we have to say, what is GDP? Well, GDP is a concept known as gross domestic product, formerly known as gross national product, invented by a guy called Simon Kuznets in the 1930s, who took it to US Congress and was like, hey, here's a really good way to measure economic transactions, but please don't use it as a measure of what he called welfare and what we now call well-being of society. The reason for that is that GDP measures transactions. It doesn't measure the value of those transactions, i.e. if they are good things that we want to see happening, and it doesn't measure the distribution of those transactions. So while we've had baked into legislation an aim for GDP growth, we haven't really been looking, at least for the last 40 plus years, into what all of that actually means. So we've seen some kind of shifts in the way that we've been framing up the wellbeing budget, but the Greens would argue, of course, it hasn't gone anywhere near far enough. So this comes to the core of your question, which is that kind of intersection between environmental and social justice. And here I'd point to research from the likes of Max Rashbrook out of Victoria University of Wellington, who's done a phenomenal amount of work on inequality in our country. And his work in, I believe, 2021, a book published towards the end of that year, found that in terms of all of the data that we have on wealth at the moment, which the likes of the work from our Revenue Minister, David Parker, has shown we don't have enough research on it, but from what we do know, and the real picture is likely to be worse given we don't have all of the data, is that the top 10% in this country own 70% of the wealth. The bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders own just 2% of the wealth.
Wow.
And that was prior to the supercharging of the last 2 years with an over-reliance on unconventional monetary policy throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, of course, I can unpack all of that stuff if you want to, but basically what that means is that instead of using what's called fiscal policy, so kind of tax and spend, the government relied on the Reserve Bank's very blunt tools to make debt cheaper. And when you make debt cheaper, that typically services people who already own assets because they can leverage those assets in order to take on more debt to acquire more stuff. And then obviously on the other side of that, hey presto, they're holding more of the capital. So I think the real question has to be, particularly when we're talking about things in the context of the cost of living crisis, but also alongside a climate crisis, which I spent 2 years trying to get Parliament to recognise, we are willing to say that we have a cost of living crisis when inflation is hitting 6 or 7%, but we also have Statistics New Zealand data that show that the least wealthy New Zealanders, that bottom half, experience inflation at roughly double the rate of the rest of the country, which means that if we're willing to call it a cost of living crisis right now, why aren't we willing to call it in normal times? Because business as usual is a cost of living crisis for at least half of the country. So this comes down to, again, those Green Party core policies that we campaigned on in 2020 and have been, running on in a multiplicity of different iterations for the past few decades, which is effectively redistribution. Because everybody, and this is to, again, the core point of your question, we are seeing that those who are responsible for the lowest emissions, those who are contributing and consuming the least, are those who are going to be disproportionately impacted by emissions rising. But those who are currently contributing the most in terms of that consumption and contribution are also those who have the resources to continue moving further and further away from the impact that they're having on the planet. So I think, what all of that really boils down to is, do we want greenwashed late-stage capitalism when we're still dealing with all of these issues of deeply entrenched inequality, and the wealthiest amongst us are able to fly to Mars or wherever Elon Musk wants to colonize next, and I'm sure the National Party would back? Or do we want to deal with the problems at home? Because jobs happen on the planet, and our economy can be one that works better for all of us. The rules that we've inherited are not natural phenomena. They were made and they can be remade.
Awesome.
So that's the short answer.
Good. Thank you, Chloe.
No worries.
And I want to ask you now about the Ministry for Disabled People. So how do you see the Greens climate change initiatives connecting with that?
Yeah, so a really good question, especially given I don't get to talk about it very much because mostly I just get asked about weed. One of the things that I'm proudest of in my time in Parliament, last term I passed my first members bill, which was the Election Access Fund Bill, now Act, which sets up a fund available for people with disabilities to run barrier-free and general elections. So it'll be up and running for the first time in this election upcoming, and that was a bill drafted by Mojo Mathers, who's a former Green MP and was the first deaf member of Parliament. So we are hopefully going to see greater representation, at the very least in the candidate pool in this upcoming general election, but of course we're not dealing with all of those other barriers that exist in society. I just want to firstly acknowledge all of those activists and advocates who fought really long and hard to get this ministry up and running in the first place, and the recognition. I think a lot of New Zealanders probably didn't know that it didn't already exist. But to your point around kind of that intersectionality of all of those different forms of justice, I think it's fundamental, and equity is one of those key points that the Greens continue to highlight. And through our, just breaking it down, in Parliament we've got 120 seats, and we would pass any law or any budget or tax or any of those things, you need at least 61 members to agree. In this term of Parliament, Labour have 65, so nothing can be done with or without them. So that means that the Greens are using, to the best of our possible power, our 10 MPs and the leverage that we get from that, and you see that reflected in the emissions reduction plan and some of those core tenets of the likes of equity, which of course really is fundamentally about recognising those historically marginalised and structurally marginalised communities, like those with disabilities. But we are not going to be able to get all of the things that we want to see happening unless we are able to build more power in negotiations and therefore in policies moving forward.
So the key is then to doing well in the next election?
Yeah, but I think, like I was having some young people at Otago all week, and it was really funny, people hitting me up at the stall and being like, this is how you'll win my vote. And I was like, bro, I don't think that's not quite how I do politics. Like, I don't think, I think it's really important that we don't individualize or celebritize political change, because if change lives or dies on one person's shoulders, then it's not sustainable in the first place, let alone regenerative or ongoing. So my kind of call to action, if there is one, is instead of going just, simple question of how do we get more people into Parliament, it's actually how do we build far more stable bridges of sharing of power between our communities who feel deeply represented in Parliament, because politics doesn't just happen every 3 years, it happens every single day with decisions that are made that impact our environments and our circumstances. So yeah, in a nutshell, definitely want more Green MPs, but also would like to see more people realising their power.
Cool. Awesome. We're going to move on to our tertiary education section.
So you've been very vocal about post-grad allowances and wanting to see them reinstated. Why would you like to see this? And do you think the government is ever going to move on this?
Yeah, so you'll find probably one of the most strongly worded press releases that has ever been attributed to my name at the start of 2020. I'd been negotiating and working with the Minister of Education, the Honourable Chris Hipkins, on a range of things to make life more affordable for students and study less barriers imposed on the pathway to study for as many New Zealanders as possible. And one of those key things for me has always been universal student allowance, and obviously ultimately getting towards a full noise fee-free situation. But that kind of got whittled down through like discussions and talks to, at the very least, what we can do is reinstate postgraduate student allowance, and the price tag of doing so is around $40 to $50 million a year. But obviously, then there's all of the other costs, all of the opportunity costs of not doing it in terms of the barriers to entry for particularly people from diverse backgrounds, and therefore the kind of research that's represented and where our country is able to move forward, and the communities and the opportunities that are presented for more kids further down the track, etc. What really gutted me is that in the COVID-19 emergency budget, when we had expected to see this, and all roads had been leading to that as the final budget of that term of Parliament and the first term of the Labour-led government, that the Minister decided to scrap it. And he also decided to scrap the second year of fees free. At a point in time when we knew that a pandemic was landing on our shores and the government was going to have to put tens of billions of dollars out of the door in order to support any range of other sectors, particularly the business sector. And that made me so angry, because we had a drop in the bucket and compared to the rest of the whole budget and compared to the rest of support that was going to be necessary, that was offered in good faith to other very loud voices in our country, but not to students who have been systematically smashed in terms of voluntary student membership and all of the other things that have intentionally undercut student power and voice in our politics for the past 10, 20 years. And this to me was just, a perfect example of where students were once again sacrificed because they were easy. So I think that it is totally feasible for it to be reinstated, but it's going to take quite a lot of effort from students recognising that, the struggle of exhaustion and cost of living and, for postgrad students, stipends being nowhere near enough to cover the cost of living and rents and everything else, and people taking out course-related costs but knowing that it's not actually course-related because it's paying for rents or essentials or energy or whatever, transport, that, how much can we kid ourselves about all of these things? And that debt being so normalised and that struggle being so normalised, where it's normalised for no other part of or sector of society, that all of that can change if we find ways to connect the dots and understand that struggle is shared, and therefore to campaign and to work towards that change. But until that happens, I think that we will continue to see students and their entitlements being traded off against everybody else, which to me is so disappointing, given that the Minister of Education and a number of Labour front benches all regularly will report and remind people of how they were once leading student associations.
Why do you think that students aren't valued in the eyes of politicians? Well, not all politicians.
I mean, students make up 6% of the population, right? And when students can't be relied on to vote in the same way that landowners can be relied on to vote, in the same way that people who consider themselves part of the business community can be relied on to vote. So I think that students really haven't organised and mobilised in a way to make their power felt. And that takes me back to that point earlier around how over the past 30 years, 40, 50 years, we've seen student power very intentionally targeted and systematically undermined. And in recent history, voluntary student membership is a classic example of that, by tethering the kind of automatic funding that student associations were getting, and therefore the ability to, plan for the future and to make long-term sustainable and regenerative campaigns and to pass the buck intentionally. We find that student associations are oftentimes having to quite deeply commercialise themselves and operate effectively as a business in order to generate money, and then having to be incredibly reactive with a very small portion of time that they have left to try and deal with student issues. And all of that stuff, all of that exhaustion creates conflict because people are at the end of their tether and might not necessarily be willing to operate in a reciprocal relationship in good faith with each other and realise their shared struggle and all of those things. But that internal conflict amongst student associations, which I don't think is a secret, is something that, again, ultimately serves only to benefit the status quo. So, I think that it's largely the fact that most politicians think that they can kind of ignore students or take them for granted, and I think that that's not going to change until students realise that 6% of the population is a party all on its own.
So really just like getting out there, lobbying, making some noise.
Yeah, and connecting. We don't need one person who's going to come out of the woodwork and then be the person who gives amazing speeches or whatever. if you look at the history of student movements in this country, and students have been at the forefront of pretty much every awesome thing that has happened in terms of like queer rights, in terms of the revitalisation of te reo, and what ended up with kind of the judicial activism around te tiriti in the 1980s. All of those things came about because, of course, students were in these environments that were conducive to cultures forming of kind of solidarity and talking about the issues and really getting into them and then mobilizing and organizing for that change. I find it so patronizing when particularly politicians, but anybody nowadays just says, oh, students don't really care or they're apathetic. Let's unpack that concept of apathy for a minute, because it's actually exhaustion and it's deep individualization, and it is telling people that, you know, they have to be wary of their future opportunities if they dare stick their neck out and fight for something that they believe in, which are all things that when you're standing shoulder by shoulder with hundreds or thousands of other people, you don't have to worry about in the same way. But in order to try and offer that fuse breaker to change the current quite individualistic kind of culture of how we sit down, shut up, keep our heads down and don't raise the alarm about issues that we're going through. And this pertains to every single sector of everything, from mental health through to economic reform, through to climate justice, through to student rights. Nothing is going to change unless something changes, you know. So I think it's just, realizing that within your flat or within your student accommodation or within your papers or, you know, on the campus that you're on, that if you just start talking to people about issues, you come to realize that it's not just your issue and it's therefore not an issue with you, it's a systemic issue, and that starts to change your mindset and enables you to figure out that you can and you deserve change.
Totally.